The rain fell like an incessant blanket on Brookhaven, that small town, forgotten among the hills and dense woods. The drops hit the windshield of Phil Sanders' old truck, dripping down in crooked lines that made it difficult to see. The sound of the wipers, squeaking as they struggled to keep up with the rain, accompanied the thunder that echoed in the distance. Phil gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling the day's fatigue weigh on his shoulders. It was as if the storm outside was an extension of his own exhausting routine. The road was long, almost deserted, and lined with dark trees that swayed menacingly in the wind. Brookhaven was a quiet town, but at night, especially on nights like this, there was something unsettling about the landscape. Phil wasn't easily frightened, but he had learned over time to respect the force of nature and to avoid the dangers that could arise on poorly lit roads. He thought about the workshop, the engines he had repaired, the angry customers who didn't understand the difference between routine maintenance and a mechanical miracle. He thought about the overdue electricity bill, the pile of mail he avoided opening. Life had never been easy, but Phil wasn't one to complain. He just got on with it, day after day. Suddenly, something caught his eye. About 50 meters ahead, the headlights of his truck illuminated a car stopped on the shoulder. The emergency lights flashed in the rain, creating an almost hypnotic effect. Next to the vehicle, an indistinct figure seemed to struggle against the open hood. Phil frowned. Who in their right mind would be in the middle of that storm trying to fix a car? He slowed down, his heart racing slightly. It wasn't unusual to hear stories about ambushes on deserted roads, but as he got closer, he realized that the figure was a woman. Her hair was completely wet, sticking to her face, and her shoulders seemed to be shaking with cold. Phil pulled the vehicle over a little and switched off the engine. He grabbed a flashlight and got out, pulling up the hood of his jacket to protect his face from the rain. The cold wind hit him like a knife, and he felt his boots sink slightly into the soggy ground. The woman turned when she heard his footsteps, and Phil could see the instant relief in her eyes, a mixture of despair and hope. "Hey, is everything all right?" he asked, his voice slightly hoarse. "No, not exactly," she replied, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "The car just died. I think it's the battery, but I'm not sure. And my cell phone is dead." Phil pointed the flashlight at the engine, saying nothing for a moment. He was used to fixing all sorts of mechanical problems, but he was also good at reading people. The woman looked exhausted, almost desperate, but there was something else there. Her eyes, although grateful, carried a shadow of fear, as if she had experienced much more than just a mishap with the car. "Can I have a look?" he asked, trying to sound as calm as possible. "Of course. Please." She took a step to the side, allowing Phil to approach. As he worked, the woman tried to hide her trembling by crossing her arms over her chest. Phil noticed but didn't comment. He knew that pride was something that many people clung to in moments of weakness. The engine was damp, but it was nothing that couldn't be fixed. "It's just the battery," he finally said, reaching for the starter cables he always kept in the truck. "I'll give it a quick charge. Let me just get the tools." When he returned, Phil noticed that she was watching him intently, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. He was used to that too. People always judged his simple appearance, a tall man with rough working hands and a weathered face. He wasn't exactly the kind of person who inspired immediate trust in strangers. "Do you do this often?" she asked, trying to break the silence. "What? Stop in the middle of the rain to help strangers?" Phil smiled sideways. "No, but everyone needs a hand now and then." He connected the cables and, within a few minutes, the sedan's engine came to life again. The woman let out an audible sigh of relief. "I can't thank you enough." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a $100 bill, holding it out to him. Phil looked at the money and then at her, shaking his head. "You don't have to. Just do the same for someone else when you get the chance." For a moment, she remained motionless, as if she couldn't believe what she had heard. Then she lowered her hand, holding the note tightly, and something changed in her expression. It was almost as if that small gesture, the refusal to pay, had broken through an invisible barrier. Phil saw a different gleam in her eyes, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something he couldn't decipher. "What's your name?" she asked. "Phil. And yours?" "Nicole." She smiled, but seemed to be fighting back tears. "Thank you, Phil, I really do. Take care, Nicole. The road can be dangerous, especially at night." He got back into his truck, started the engine, and disappeared into the rain, without realizing that he had just changed the course not only of that night, but of his own life. The rain was relentless, turning the night into an almost apocalyptic scenario. Nicole stood beside her sedan as the roar of the newly started engine echoed on the deserted road. She saw the rear lights of Phil's truck disappear between the trees, leaving her with a mixture of relief and bewilderment. Why would anyone help a complete stranger without expecting anything in return, even more so on a night like that, with the wind howling as if it wanted to rip the trees out by the roots? Nicole got into the car and closed the door tightly, trying to protect herself from the rain. But as she turned on the heater to get rid of the cold, she realized that her hands were still shaking, and it wasn't just because of the weather. Something about that brief interaction with Phil had stirred something deep within her. It had been a long, long time since she had felt such an authentic connection with someone, even for just a few minutes. She thought about how she had gotten to that point, trapped in a failing marriage, struggling to maintain a facade of success while her personal life fell apart. That night's meeting had been the last straw. She had made the decision to walk away from everything, her job, her expectations, the people around her who didn't really care about her. And then the car died, as if the universe wanted to remind her that even her escape wouldn't be easy. The sound of the car's engine now running brought her back to the present. Phil had refused the money. Just return the favor to someone else someday. His words echoed in her head. It wasn't just what he had said, but how he had said it, with such genuine simplicity that it almost hurt. People like that didn't exist anymore, she thought, or maybe she just didn't pay enough attention to notice them. Nicole looked in the rearview mirror, but the road was empty. There were no more headlights, just the darkness of the forest and the sound of the rain beating against the glass. She was alone again, and for the first time in a long time, that didn't seem so scary. The sun had barely begun to rise from behind the hills when Phil was awoken by an unusual sound, the roar of a powerful engine coming up the gravel road that led to his house. He pulled aside the faded curtains and frowned as he saw the black luxury SUV pull up in front of his small cottage. The impeccable tires seemed out of place on the uneven ground, full of puddles of rainwater that had not yet dried from the previous storm. Two men in perfectly tailored suits got out of the vehicle. Both seemed out of place in the rural environment, as if they had been teleported straight from a corporate meeting on Wall Street. Phil felt his heart racing, a mixture of curiosity and caution. It wasn't every day that such sophisticated figures appeared on his doorstep. "What the hell?" he muttered to himself as he opened the door with a firm but hesitant hand. One of the men stepped forward, a polished smile on his lips. "Mr. Sanders?" he asked with a tone that sounded more like affirmation than doubt. "It's me, sir. Who's asking?" Phil replied, crossing his arms. The man opened an elegant envelope and took out a card with gold edges. He handed it to Phil, who read the name at the top, Nicole Everly. "Miss Everly has asked us to come and collect you. She wanted to thank you personally for the help you gave her the other night," the man explained. Phil blinked, confused. He hadn't expected to hear her name again, let alone under such circumstances. He briefly considered refusing. After all, he had already done his bit. But curiosity was a stubborn beast, and he knew he wouldn't be able to concentrate on his work in the workshop if he didn't find out what was going on. "Right," he finally answered, throwing the keys to the truck into his pocket. "Let me change first." A few minutes later, Phil was in the back seat of the SUV, looking around the luxurious interior. The tinted windows made him feel uncomfortable, as if they were trying to hide something. He had never ridden in such a sophisticated car, and honestly preferred the simplicity of his old truck, which creaked at every turn, but was as reliable as a long-time friend. The journey was silent, except for the soft sound of the engine. The two men in front said nothing, but indicated that they were heading for a property on the outskirts of town. Phil watched the landscape go by, recognizing some sections of the road, but as they approached their destination, everything seemed different. As the SUV turned into a lane surrounded by tall, well-kept oak trees, Phil felt his breathing quicken. At the end of the road, a colossal mansion rose up, with a facade of white columns and windows that shone in the morning light. He looked down at his hands, feeling the sweat accumulate on his palms. He couldn't imagine what such a rich and powerful woman could want with someone like him. Stepping out of the car, Phil was led to a main entrance adorned with carved solid wood doors. The smell of wet earth mingled with the scent of flowers he couldn't name. He hesitated for a moment before entering, but the butler, yes, a butler, who opened the door seemed to be expecting him. "This way, Mr. Sanders," said the butler, leading him through a vast lobby decorated with crystal chandeliers and works of art that could be in museums. The marble floor reflected Phil's footsteps, which seemed increasingly out of place. Finally, they reached a living room where Nicole was waiting for him. She was sitting in a blue velvet armchair with a smile that seemed more genuine than Phil had expected. She wore simple clothes, but there was something about her posture that gave away her position of power. "Phil, how nice of you to accept my invitation," she said, rising to greet him. "Please, sit down." Phil accepted the invitation, but remained alert. He didn't know if it was a thank you or an elaborate trap. Nicole seemed to notice his hesitation and laughed softly. "Don't worry, there are no tricks here." She gestured to a tray with coffee and cookies. "Tudim, would you like something to eat or drink?" "I'm fine, thanks," Phil replied dryly. He crossed his arms. "So, what does all this mean? Why am I here?" Nicole leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Her smile disappeared, giving way to a serious expression. "Phil, what you did that night may seem small to you, but to me, it meant everything." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I was going through a very difficult time. Everything seemed to be falling apart around me, and I was about to give up something that meant a lot to me." She began to explain that she was CEO of a company dedicated to sustainability projects, but had recently been facing pressure from shareholders to abandon an innovative project that could revolutionize clean energy. That night's meeting had been the last straw. When my car broke down, I felt completely defeated. But then you came along and reminded me that there is still good in this world. You didn't ask for anything in return. You just helped because you wanted to. And that rekindled something in me, something I thought I'd lost. Phil listened in silence, uncomfortable with the intensity of the conversation. He wasn't good at dealing with compliments, let alone emotional statements. "Well, I'm glad it helped, but I didn't do anything special," he said at last. Nicole shook her head in disagreement. "You've done a lot more than you realize, and now I want to give something back." She pointed to a small safe on the coffee table. "Inside that chest are 3 presents. I want you to choose one of them. It's my way of saying thank you for the impact you've had on my life." Phil stared at the small box on the table, feeling an unexpected weight fall on his shoulders. The idea of choosing a gift seemed simple at first glance, but Nicole's tone and the environment they were in made everything seem loaded with meaning. He ran a hand through his stubbly beard, hesitating to move. "A safe, huh?" he said, trying to ease the tension. "That sounds more like a TV game than a thank you." Nicole smiled slightly, but didn't respond to the provocation. Instead, she gestured gently for him to continue. Phil took a deep breath and leaned over to open the safe. The mechanism clicked gently, revealing 3 items carefully arranged inside. The first item was a plain white envelope. Phil opened it and almost lost his breath when he saw the check inside. The amount was astronomical, enough for him to never have to work again in his life. He felt his heart race as he imagined what he could do with all that money. Buy a new house, pay off his debts, maybe even help other people as he himself had always wanted. It was an easy solution to all his problems, but at the same time it felt wrong. Money of this kind wasn't something he was used to accepting, and something in him told him that it might come with an invisible price. He put the check aside, swallowing. The second item was a small silver keyring with the logo of a luxury car brand. Phil held the keys between his fingers, feeling the cold weight of the metal. He knew what it represented, a new car, perhaps even the same SUV that had brought him here. Throughout his life, Phil had never driven anything but used pickup trucks, and the idea of owning a 0-kilometer car was tempting. But at the same time, it seemed superfluous. He already had a vehicle that worked most of the time, and he didn't see himself as the kind of person who would go for something so extravagant. He put the keys back, frowning as he thought. The last item was a black envelope with a gold seal. When Phil opened it, he found a formal contract with Nicole's company logo on the header. The document offered him a position as head of a technical team that would work directly on one of the company's sustainability projects. He read the details, trying to understand what it really meant. It wasn't just a job. It was a chance to be part of something bigger, something that could have an impact on the world. But there were risks. Phil had no experience in the corporate world, and the idea of leaving his simple life behind scared him. He knew how to fix engines, but leading a team in a multinational company, it was a huge responsibility. What if he failed? Nicole watched in silence as Phil processed each option. He closed the safe and rubbed his face, trying to clear his thoughts. "This is a lot to take in," he said at last. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to decide now," Nicole replied softly. "I just want you to know that whatever you choose, my gratitude remains the same. You changed my perspective that night, and that's worth everything." Phil nodded, but the weight of the decision still weighed on him. He spent the next 2 days mulling over the options, each one offering a different way of changing his life. When Phil finally returned to the mansion, Nicole greeted him with the same warm smile as before. He was carrying the black envelope with the contract in his hands. "I've decided to take the job," he said, his voice firm but with a touch of nervousness. "I don't know if I'm the best choice for it, but I want to try. I want to do something that means something." Nicole smiled, genuinely moved. "You're making the right choice, Phil, and don't worry, I know you'll do well. You have something that many people in this world have lost: authenticity." The first few months in the new job were challenging for Phil. He had to learn to navigate in a completely different environment from the workshop. However, his practical skills and work ethic soon stood out. The team he led, made up of brilliant engineers and scientists, quickly began to respect him, not only for his dedication, but also for his humility. Nicole, for her part, became more than a boss. She became a mentor and a friend. She helped Phil understand that even in a world full of vested interests and power plays, it was possible to make a difference while maintaining his integrity. Over time, Phil began to realize the impact of his work. The sustainability projects he was helping to lead were transforming communities and creating real solutions to environmental problems. And although life still presented challenges, he felt something he hadn't felt for years: purpose. Years later, Phil returned to Brookhaven to visit his old home. He parked the car, now a discreet but modern model, on the gravel driveway and looked at the cottage. The paint was worn, the boards creaked, but he felt a nostalgic warmth as he remembered the lonely nights he had spent there. As he walked along the road that had once taken him to Nicole, he thought about the irony of how it had all started. A rainy night, a broken-down car, a simple gesture. He could never have imagined that that moment would change his life forever. He smiled, thinking of the words he had said to Nicole that night. Just return the favor to someone else someday. Now he understood the true power of that advice. And with that, Phil Sanders' story became a living reminder that even the simplest gestures can trigger extraordinary transformations.